you know, we've got a fabulous group of people here, many of them experts on different aspects of the environment and its interface with business. It's a good mix. We've got researchers and analysts who will hear from first, and then in particular we're going to bring in, we've got Caroline Lucas from the Green Party, and also Alan Rusbridger and many other distinguished journalists who can talk to us about when the word of the experts and the think tank reports of the kind of things that we're going to be hearing from, when those do and do not count in news terms, because changing what counts in news terms is obviously going to be very important to changing the conversation. We've got hundreds and hundreds of people tuning in, which is great to know. We've also got the biggest panel I've ever done anything with. So I'm going to resist the standard temptation to go around and introduce everyone at the beginning of the session, or we'll use too much of it. But very roughly, we're going to be hearing from people who've got something to say about nature versus business from an expert point of view first, and then we're going to hear from the journalists about what does and doesn't count as newsworthy in this connection, and then finally we're going to hopefully have time for my colleague Chris, who's hidden behind that prospect nature versus business screen there, to bring in a few of the audience questions that you're able to tap on the Q&A function, and he'll read them and pull out some of the sharpest ones. Keep them brief to maximize your chance of getting through with that. I think that's everything from prospect in terms of introduction. I'd love to say, first of all, thank you to the Gulbenkian Foundation for kindly supporting all of this and this timely and important discussion. And so first of all, I'm going to turn to Andrew Barnett, who's from Gulbenkian, to fill us in on nature versus business as they see it.
Well, thank you, Tom, and thank you to the amazing panel that you've put together, who are going to address this important subject of the health of the ocean, and also to the audience who are here today. Invariably, when you pit things against each other, neither comes off well. That's the sort of history of humankind, and we're obviously in unprecedented times, facing as we do the pandemic, and it's telling that the governments across the world have adopted policies which have put people and nature first, certainly not the economy first. So it's not the first time that causes may have been prioritized for reasons other than economic ones. And I mean, of course, the sea is a source of many jobs, many of them low paid, many producing things which the poorest people live off. But it's not simply a resource for all of us to plunder. It's 70% of the world's planet. It produces half of the oxygen we breathe. It is if you like, the lungs of our planet. And we harm those lungs like a smoker harms his or her lungs at our peril. Because the impact on our climate, think of extreme weather conditions, think of the threat, as I alluded earlier to, the reduction in protein availability through overfishing that impacts upon some of the poorest people in the world. Those are consequences of overexploitation of the ocean, and we at the foundation have spent many years trying to push this issue up the agenda. And you know, people sometimes talk about you know, the opportunity that the pandemic has given us, and I think that's sort of got a sort of jarring positivity to it. But let's nevertheless understand that you know, clearly that the health situation we're facing at the moment is one that we need to bear in mind. Can happen when nature gets out of its balance, and to rebalance these things, like in particular the to put the ocean ahead of business is an opportunity we've got now that we are prioritising those things, those natural resources which we hold dear. So we've supported a marine collab, 9 NGOs from across the marine sector to come together and innovate and particularly work out how best to talk about these issues with the general public. And the use of body metaphors is said to work. And but I think it's really important to bear in mind that we've got time to do this, not long, but it is soluble. And one of the biggest things that we can do is to start at the beginning, if you like, with by reducing our carbon footprint. Fossil fuels push up the temperature of the ocean with effects on coral and a whole series of subsequent species. And we need to start with reducing our climate footprint, because that is it's carbon, which is the greatest pollutant of all. And we can make the ocean good business rather than bad business. And the time to put it on the agenda is now. And I'm hugely pleased to be working with Prospect Magazine and the panelists to talk about the problem we face and how we can communicate the problem and the solutions to the public and policymakers with whom this needs to have resonance.
Thank you very much indeed, Andrew. Now, the next thing we're going to do, very briefly, and I'm going to say very briefly to everyone, just because we've got so many panelists here, is bring in Natalie Hart, who's the researcher for the One Ocean team. And I think she's going to try and share with us a few slides, by which we mean maybe 3 slides. And this is research that she's been involved with, which has been presented amongst others to UN, COP26 and UNESCO. Natalie, it's over to you.
Thank you, Tom. I think Chris had the slide to share, but it's not required, so I'm quite happy just to talk through the research as it is. So in April this year, after the UK went into lockdown, we began to analyse qualitative data gathered from media monitoring and social media listening. So the data that we gathered focused on the intersection between COVID-19, the environment and the ocean in global English language media and English language social media. So on a weekly basis, we looked at the narratives, trends and patterns emerging in a rapidly shifting communications environment, with the specific objective of advising ocean-focused organisations across the world on how to communicate effectively, but also sensitively in this period. So the research was funded by the David and Lucille Packard Foundation, but many of the recommendations arising from the research were implemented in the Calouste Gulbenkian funded Marine Collab. So what did we find in this research that makes today's conversation, the question of whether we can really decouple planetary health and economic recovery, feel so necessary? The first relevant finding was that many people felt an increased sense of connection during lockdown to each other, to their communities, to the planet and to nature. And so this connection to nature played out both in positive and negative terms, beginning with coverage of the zoonotic source of the disease. So then through social media listening, we saw that some people struggled with missing their access to nature during lockdown. We saw some people take great comfort and solace in the outdoors in their daily walks. Some people witnessed wildlife thrive outside their homes on a really hyper-local level, and then they saw this reflected on a global scale through social media and media coverage. And the other interesting thing we saw were people finding innovative ways to connect with nature during this period. So for example, through streaming services from zoos and aquariums and online citizen science projects. Now, as the tone of the conversation became more forward-focused through lockdown, what we saw next were aspirational voices that you referred to, calling for us to build back better. And many of these advocated for a recovery with environmental protection at its heart. So the data indicated that the pause of lockdown experienced by many of us was a moment to reflect on what we value and then call to protect this going forwards. And we really saw a range of voices involved in this conversation that included NGOs, influential individuals, business leaders, politicians, and more. And so for some people, the sort of rapid, large-scale changes in policy and public behaviour that we saw at this time were proof that the changes needed for the planet at the pace and scale required were indeed possible. As we then transitioned out of lockdown, conversations on exactly how to build back better became increasingly technical in nature. So discussions focused on what better meant in practical terms and the extent to which it was possible as governments and industry began to make decisions that would really shape the future. And it was at this point that we saw the overall tone in much of the coverage and conversation begin to turn from aspirational to pragmatic to increasingly pessimistic. So we saw counter voices begin to emerge that posited that actually the policies required for a fast economic recovery for jobs, income, financial security were not compatible with environmental protection. And what we saw that concerned us as communicators, and is very much the focus of the discussion for today, was a tendency for the debate to slip back into the old paradigm of people versus planet. So the discussion, whether consciously or otherwise, began to be framed as a choice between the well-being of people on one hand and the well-being of the planet on the other. So nature and business were very much decoupled, and it presented economic recovery and environmental protection with varying degrees of nuance as mutually exclusive, and indicated to audiences across the globe that what we continue to face is actually a choice between one and the other.
Fantastic. Is that finished, Natalie? Thank you very much indeed. A lot of food for thought there just by watching what people are talking about. Now, next we've got Akanksha Khatri, who is from the World Economic Forum. Now, I think your report is out tomorrow, which we're happy to send everyone who's registered a link for. And so I'd like to invite you to speak about the report, The Future of Nature and Business, that you've been looking at over at the World Economic Forum, but on the proviso and on the understanding that like you might not be able to say everything about this report at this stage. Over to you.
Thank you so much. And I'm really glad to be going right after Natalie because it seems to be a perfect segue, that there is no disconnect between economic growth and people. So over the past year, I think thanks to the work of many of you here, climate change, of course, has been consistently rising in the media coverage. Which is great, but one of the key messages that will be coming out from the report that we are releasing tomorrow is that while fighting for climate change is important, it is not enough. Climate change accounts for anywhere between 11 and 16% of nature loss. So in order to meet our goals of halting biodiversity and nature loss, it is equally important for us to also be focusing on other key drivers, primary of which being how we are actually consuming and producing our food, and just picking up on also the point that Andrew was talking about, how do we manage sustainably our land, ocean, and seascapes. Every year in Davos, the forum comes out with its annual global risk survey. And for the first time in its 15-year history, the top 5 risks which were identified were all environmental. And therefore, as part of the overall work of the forum, we are producing this series of new nature economy reports. So it is really a set of 3 reports. The first one was released in January, which tried to bring the topic of nature loss and risks to the boardroom discussion and help businesses understand that the loss of nature is actually material to their businesses. One key stat, if I were just to highlight, is that over $44 trillion, or nearly half of the world's GDP, is moderately or highly dependent on nature loss. So it is actually in the interest of the future of businesses to invest in nature, both for protection as well as sustainable use and management. The second report, as you rightly said, Tom, is releasing tomorrow, and we most welcome this group to join the press conference as well as go through the report. But that looks at going beyond risks into opportunities and identifies 15 strategic systemic transitions, which, if implemented, could create $10.1 trillion of business opportunities and create 395 million jobs by 2030. So there is a nature positive economic pathway. The question is, are we willing to make changes in how we produce food and use our land, ocean, and seas? Second, how we build infrastructure and design our urban areas. And third, how we power our lives and extract minerals from the ground. And I think just as an example of bring it to light, I want to pick up on what Andrew said earlier, is that the marine areas are actually a very important source of livelihoods and economic growth. And some of the early estimates suggest that if you look at the wild catch volume, it could increase by 24% by 2030 if all fisheries were managed within maximum sustainable yields. And compare this 24% with the projected 15% drop if we continue business as usual. So this is just an estimate to say that it is in the interest of business and the economy to protect and sustainably use and manage our natural resources. And again, I think some of the conversation that we are having here talks about prioritization in the times of COVID, when financial resources, maybe political will and ambition is also limited. Our research, again, which will come out tomorrow, suggests that for us to be able to capture that $10 trillion of business opportunities, all that we need to invest is $2.7 trillion. So that's the capital we are talking about. And if I were to draw comparison for you, just in the US alone, in the month of March of 2020, US announced a stimulus package of $2.2 trillion. So the question isn't so much about constraint of resources. The question again is, can we generate enough momentum with citizens to put pressure on our political leaders to put this on the agenda so we take the decision collectively? So if we were to really look at what is the key policy ambition that we need, and I know that we will have Caroline talk about this in a few minutes, is can we focus on enhancing resource productivity? So truly decouple economic growth from resource extraction, but really optimize our relationship through circular economy models, protect and restore natural capital assets, something that the UK government is also looking to put at the center of the climate COP next year in terms of natural climate solutions. And lastly, scale regenerative value chains to talk about agriculture and mariculture from a regenerative point of view, rather than the traditional way that we have learned over the last 70 years. So I'll pause over here, but just thanks again for having me.
Thank you very, very much indeed. And just to underline, we'll be happy to send that report round to everyone tomorrow. Just going to remind everyone we need to keep tightly to time just because there's so many of us here. We've got two more experts, as it were, before we get to some of the media pundits. So next up, it's Torsten Thiel, who's the founder, indeed, of the Global Ocean Trust, who'll give us some thoughts on how far or not it's possible to have a different sort of recovery that maybe gives some more thought to nature.
Thank you very much and good morning. And I'm glad to follow on from Akanksha, because what I think comes out very clearly is that not only are the two things not in conflict, but really we need clear narratives how they go together. And it's that understanding, that systematic integration that we need to communicate, that biodiversity, ocean and climate are an integrated package that can be invested into as such. And that is why it's so important to communicate concepts like blue natural capital, i.e. a way to financially understand and deliver the opportunity. And since Akanksha talked about the food system, I'll pick up the infrastructure point. Blue infrastructure finance is really a way of saying that in the coastal and marine space, nature-based solutions are not only an effective way to deliver on the environmental challenges, but in particular, deliver in addition on the risk reduction and the investment opportunity side of the equation. So if in a coastal zone you are faced with additional ocean risk and storm damage and need adaptation, think about the nature component, the way the wetlands, the way the mangroves, the way the seagrasses can all contribute and deliver on a whole range of environmental and societal benefits. And I think it's really, that's why I use the language of building forward back better. It's not just back, it's not just better, it's forward looking and integrating these. So there's a clear narrative that we need to communicate that works with the financial sector and that is shovel ready, because nature is ready to do this right now. So that's why this is the right entry point from an ocean and environmental standpoint to deliver societal and governance goals, and does require some governance action at the same time. So like for the high seas, we need the high seas treaty in order to have protected areas in order to optimize the use of the high seas. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Torsten. And now I'm going to bring in Professor Dan Loffley, who is at the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, who's going to say, I think, a few words about why scientists are increasingly realizing the language that we use to talk about the planet matters an awful lot for what ends up happening scientifically to that planet.
Thanks so much indeed, Tom, and hello everyone, and it's a pleasure to be joining you today. Yeah, so we're working on a paper, an IPSO marine science paper, about the importance of correctly describing and framing the ocean. And the reason why it's important is because, frankly, we're still not getting it, if I can put it that way. Torsten talked about the importance of the narrative, and if I can characterize it, the scale and nature of the problem is not being met by the scale and nature of the response. And what we see is a shift in our knowledge from what people may be familiar with in terms of the problems of the ocean being about fisheries, pollution and habitat destruction, to, since 2005, the emergence through into the sort of public world to a degree about gross changes to the ocean at the whole ocean scale. So when we look at the issue, we have a combination of direct impacts, but we also have the challenge of the ocean tending to more acidic conditions, the ocean heating up. Most of the heat that's trapped is going into the ocean, and the ocean losing its oxygen. And what we need to be able to communicate is the correct description and framing of the ocean, so that we have the right ambition in terms of how we're making decisions. At the end of the day, it isn't about nature versus business. We're, frankly, excuse the pun, we're all in the same boat. And the scale of changes that we are unleashing have not really been witnessed since people walked the earth, if you like, if you want to describe it that way. And our response is piecemeal and still fragmented. So getting this narrative right is critically important, and understanding the importance of investing in the ocean. We've heard from the sort of sustainable ocean side that you invest, you get 5 times back. If you look at the protection side, where countries are very reluctant to properly protect the ocean, it's the same order of magnitude. You invest, you'll get 5 times the benefits back. So there is an economic case to be answered here in terms of current and future benefits. But what we see is the decision making and the scale of ambition is out of kilter with the scale of the problems that we see. We're still making short-term decision making, whereas science shows us that if we invest now, the returns are going to be over the coming decades. The short-termism is to a degree about political re-election, but it's also about vested interests. And we need to change. We need to change because ultimately, when we look back in Earth's history at what happens when you perturbate the ocean, species die is basically the consequence. The last 5 times we've had this in the Earth's history, if it's got too warm or it's got too cold, species die. And we are driving that process far faster than in Earth's history. And so we sit at a moment where we can reflect on what COVID taught us, alongside all the terrible agony and personal problems, both to individuals and to economies, it was perhaps the first time in modern history where we all realized perhaps we can't have everything we want now, and we can't have more, and that our relationship with nature has got too uncomfortably close, and that we are going to have to actually look at it realistically and invest in the future. So the paper we have coming out, which will be published in the next few months, looks at what that framing should look like now and what it should say and the reasons for that, in the hope that it will better connect the science world to the policy world, so that we actually take this once in a lifetime opportunity and do the right things. We don't have the next generation look back and go, they were smart, but they didn't act. We need to act.
Thank you very much, and nice to finish on a rallying cry there. I'm just going to divert from the notes slightly here, because I think, I believe we've got, Caroline may have to go a bit earlier, and I think it's a natural point on which to end there, picking up on some of Dan's points, Caroline, to bring you in. He's saying that the great obstacles here, the familiar ones, that combination of short-termism that comes with the need to seek re-election and vested interests that bear on people in very practical ways. We know there's a community of people, you know, in political terms, I guess many of them would be supporters of the Green Party, but also other parties as well, who are very interested in hearing all these arguments for a more long-term approach we've heard about in the discussion so far. But you're the only politician who's won a seat for the Green Party at a local level. And so I guess you at least have had to preach beyond the converted. Listening to some of what Dan said there, any tips for the rest of us on how that can be done?
Well, thank you so much to Prospect for the opportunity to say a few words. And I guess my message might be that we shouldn't underestimate the public. I think quite often they're ahead of where governments are, and you know, with a framing of a message that is compelling, there's a lot more ambition out there than we might give them credit for. I take a lot of reassurance from the evidence that Natalie was demonstrating about the number of people who absolutely recognise that after this pandemic there must be no going back to business as usual, because business was failing the vast majority of people. Business as usual was failing the vast majority of people and trashing the planet that we all depend on. I think there is a real appetite there for policies like a Green New Deal, the kind of once in a generation opportunity to transform the infrastructure of our society at the speed and scale that the science demands, and in the process to fix that economic model that is broken. I think it's really interesting to see that more and more evidence as well, most recently from Oxford University, the report from Stiglitz and Stern, showing that investment in the green economy is actually one of the best ways to stabilize the economy, to get people back to work. It has much faster returns on investment. And so I think you've also got the sort of advice coming into government saying that, you know, arguing for a green economy isn't just some special pleading for the environment. It actually makes the best economic sense right now as well. Where I see the real challenge, and this might be my challenge that I would put down, is that I think we need to go further than that. It's not enough simply to prioritize green investment as we come out of this pandemic. I think we need to do some deeper rewiring, repurposing and reimagining of our economy as well. That's something that Greta Thunberg said when she was speaking to the UN Climate Summit last year, when she said we are in the beginning of a mass extinction and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. I think she was spot on, and I would also point to what I believe is a bit of a fairy tale as well, and that is that there is some idea that we can have decoupling of production from emissions at the scale and the speed that the science demands. I'm not denying that some degree of decoupling is possible. It's clearly already happening and we need to promote that and push it as fast as we can. But I don't think that should lead us into thinking that we don't need to radically change the aims of our economy. And I want to just very quickly give 3 causes for hope about why I think that's not an over-ambitious aspiration. First of all, we've got the leading scientists from the world collaborating on a report that was recently put on the IPSO Forum, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And those scientists said this: as with the climate and biodiversity crises, recent pandemics are a direct consequence of human activity, particularly our global financial and economic systems, based on a limited paradigm that prizes economic growth at any cost. We have a small window of opportunity in overcoming the challenges of the current crisis to avoid sowing the seeds of future ones. In other words, let us not jump out of the COVID frying pan into the climate fire, and we need to do more than just retrofit a few homes, vital though that is. So I take some hope from that. I take some hope from the Das Gupta report, a report that was commissioned by the Treasury, and it's a report into a review of economics and biodiversity. It published its interim findings just recently. And again, it says, and I quote, "We need to acknowledge that the human economy is embedded within, not external to, nature, which helps us to recognize the limits nature places on our economy and the importance of revisiting our measures of success, including looking beyond GDP in order to maximize our wealth and well-being and that of future generations." So there you've got advisors to the government reminding us that we need to have different goals for our economy, not GDP growth alone. We've got the establishment of things like the Wellbeing Economy Government Partnership, the WeGo partnership of countries like Scotland, Iceland, New Zealand, Finland, recently Wales. Unfortunately, England hasn't joined them yet. But there again, they are collaborating on well-being economy policies and defining success using different indicators like equality, employment, mental health, natural capital, rather than GDP alone. And very finally, I think what's exciting is that some businesses are actually getting this as well and again are ahead of the politicians. I noticed a statement from a coalition of businesses that recently said, a business that will succeed is one that is able to make a decision that favors people and planet, even when there might be trade-offs with the goal of profit maximization. Now, I know we all want to say there are no trade-offs, but actually there are. There are loads of win-wins. Let's get those first for sure. But there are also some trade-offs, which I think we need to be honest about. The question is, can governments make public policy and spending decisions that favor health and well-being of people and planet, even when there might be a trade-off with short-term GDP growth? The answer during the COVID crisis has clearly been yes. I think our challenge is to make sure that the answer outside of the COVID crisis remains yes, so that the well-being of people and ecosystems becomes our ultimate economic goal. And finally, just to say that there is an all-party group on limits to growth, of which I am a chair, and Professor Tim Jackson at the Centre for Sustainable Prosperity at the University of Surrey provides the secretariat for that. And that is a kind of a hub in Parliament to push some of these ideas.
Thank you very much indeed, Caroline. I'm now going to bring in Alan Rusbridger, who's the principal at Lady Margaret Hall, Oxford, and also the long-term and legendary editor of The Guardian. Alan, first thing I'd like to ask you is, listening, like Caroline saying there are trade-offs, we need to be honest about them, but we heard before from Akanksha and others about how, you know, there might be trillions of business opportunity if we could look at this stuff in more enlightened ways. So there's two ways of looking at this. But is one difficulty with getting a kind of progressive business agenda, if there is such a thing, onto the front pages, that we journalists just like conflict too much? So we want to hear about the trade-off bit of it and the one side against the other, rather than the possibility of, gloriously transcending that sort of argument.
Well, I mean, I think that the big picture is that COVID has taught us some truths about the media business. One is that journalism and the business of information is literally a matter of life and death. And I think that the penny has dropped with journalists that how they report on policy and health matters at the moment can lead to a life or death, and I think that's been a very sobering moment for journalism. The other is that the business model that we knew was in trouble is even more in trouble. So that we know that for most news outlets, the way that the news has worked the last several generations is simply not going to be sustainable in future. So it's a moment of reevaluation for all journalists, I think, and I think this is going to lead to a shift in which journalists are going to have to ask themselves exactly what business they're in. Now, for a long time, they were able to be in the entertainment business and the opinion business as well as, or more so than, the news business. And again, when we think of COVID and we think of climate change, which is obviously also a matter of life and death, I think the premium is not going to be on entertainment or opinion, because that is so freely available everywhere else. The thing that matters is reliable news and facts that we can trust. We've got a world at the moment that is floating in a sea of information. And I think people are really frightened. I think people realize that they need reliable news. So the question is whether news, because the business model is really gone, can reinvent itself as a form of public service, because there is a corresponding appetite from the public for information that is trustworthy, and the realization that societies simply can't work unless it begins with a bedrock of information that we can agree on.
Thank you very much. Can I just ask you one other question, which is really related to what we heard from Natalie Hart about the kind of moving nature of the discussion, earlier on in the pandemic, about reconnecting with nature, and then later this kind of like creeping sense of people versus nature kind of setting in through the some of the messages from business. How do you see the role of an editor in all of this? Do you think they should be seeing what discussion people are having on social media and trying to kind of curate a conversation around that? In other words, that social media is the kind of meta editor of editors now? Or do you think still that editors can hope to frame the discussion and maybe nudge it in some more progressive directions on these kind of questions?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think the most enlightened editors, of course, we could spend a whole session agreeing that there are all kinds of things wrong and hateful about social media, but at the same time, it is the most extraordinary window into what billions of people think. We've never had that before, and I think the most attuned and enlightened and forward-looking editors use social media in a way precisely to do what you're suggesting, to see and pick up on changes in the public mood, and to see the way people are talking about things, rather than, as I think the worst editors do, operating from a sense of their own ideology or their own viewpoints. Remember, a lot of editors literally never leave the office. They can't. It's a very busy job. They don't meet people. So this whole question of how journalists inform themselves about public moods and what the nature of the craft itself is, which I think, maybe journalists are taken for, we assume that we know what it is or that people trust it. Well, obviously they don't. So I think there's going to have to be a great rethinking of how you combine these two things, the amazing availability of information about people's viewpoints, and the trying to create a new rigor around the craft of journalism itself. Thank you very much.
Alan, I'm going to bring in now Stephen Brown from Politico. Stephen, if it's a long way from the nature side of things, it's a long way from front pages often at the moment. It's an even longer way from the political ding-dong and a lot of the kind of lobby side of journalism, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's right. The thing is, it does reach us in quite urgent terms. So, for example, on Friday, we've got a summit of EU leaders here. One of the biggest subjects there is going to be this idea of a green recovery. And, can they, there are trillions of dollars sloshing around the world at the moment in public spending. Lobbying has intensified, to get chunks of that money for different areas. And the EU leaders are under some stress at the moment in order to sort of ensure that their whole Green Deal doesn't go out the window because of the requirements of recovery from the COVID crisis. And then we see sort of elements of this debate happening all the time. On the weekend, there was a Polish election where a very conservative president, Duda, won a new term. And we know for a fact that means there's going to be more pushback against elements of the green recovery. You know, Poland is defending its coal interests. And I think one of the things we've seen here is also, you know, outside my window in central Brussels every Friday before the COVID crisis were the Fridays for Future marches. I was previously, you know, in Davos and a few places where Greta Thunberg and many other young people were, if you like, managing to make this sometimes quite abstract, sometimes quite distant, unfortunately, it can seem quite distant argument, very real. And I think they proved an extremely effective way for journalists like myself of bringing this story alive. And I really hope that, you know, once the social restrictions, the social distancing dies down a little bit, that we'll be able to see a resurgence of that, because I think the fact that so many older people like myself, you know, are for some reason found these young people to be challenging. We're trying to push them back into their classrooms on Fridays. That, if you like, created this conflict that was extremely interesting and useful for this whole discussion, and gave it an element of dynamism that sometimes the statistics and the science are difficult for journalists to traduce onto the front pages, even though they should definitely make the effort, as Professor Laffoley was arguing earlier.
Thank you very much. I'm going to bring in Jessica now, Jessica Aldred from the China Dialogue. I guess for the planet, Jessica, the way in which these things are discussed in the very different world of the Chinese press is important. Have you any thoughts on that, any reflections on how papers in China write about the environment these days?
Yeah, I'm slightly worried about being the only person to speak on behalf of China in the current climate, but yeah, just from our point of view, I think, yeah, so I mean, we're very much focusing on kind of opportunities for collaboration. I think what has played very well with Chinese audiences is when environmental issues are positioned as a human health angle. That worked particularly well with tackling air quality and pollution some time ago. What we're trying to focus on now is very much looking at opportunities for collaboration with China and the rest of the world, and focusing on particularly the oceans and biodiversity. And opportunities where we can have a discussion about bringing nature and people together. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought there. Yeah, so we're very much keeping an eye on, so China's it's leading the nature-based work stream as part of the climate talks, and it's also hosting the biodiversity COP next year, which is seen as a really key moment to show leadership in that area. And it will also be interesting to see what happens with the EU-China summit, which has been postponed until the autumn in terms of climate progress. But I think very much for us, it's about kind of talking about these problems as a collective issues and what are the opportunities to work together and collaborate, as opposed to the kind of shrill finger pointing and blame game which is going on in some sections of the media. So it's also about highlighting the kind of cause and effect. So, you know, when nature and people have worked together, what are the benefits and how can we kind of showcase those best case scenarios? And also what happens when that goes wrong? And, you know, just being straight with the facts about that, and trying to find Chinese voices to talk about these issues as well, so that it's not just one side of the debate.
Thank you very much indeed, Jessica. And Adam Bourne now, who's the chief reporter at The New Scientist. I just wanted to bring in, obviously it's slightly different realm writing about it in The New Scientist, where people are looking out for scientific stories. I was interested in Jessica's point there about kind of reframing it. In China, it plays very well as a public health matter. Do you see linkages between different parts of the science as an important way in getting some of the messages across here, Adam?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think, you know, certainly one of the interesting things is seen sort of environment stories bleeding into health stories and vice versa. So, you know, you find that, you know, you're talking to a climate scientist and they'll sort of, you know, then we'll segue into, you know, COVID-19 and how we recover. And so I think there's a sort of blurring of beats there and divisions of stories. I think, you know, in terms of the sort of broader question of this debate, you know, the old canard of jobs versus environment, I think it's a bit of a mixed bag really in terms of what progress we've made on the framing of it. I mean, I think, you know, if you look at what public figures and groups are saying and how it's being reported, it's some of it's really regressive and some of it's quite progressive. You know, I think aviation's a really good example. You know, we had a couple of weeks ago, you know, the UN International Civil Aviation Organization, which watered down the sort of first and only climate deal for airlines, spun it on social media as great news for the environment. And apart from, you know, titles like ourselves and sort of more specialist press, by and large, that went, you know, unreported. Most people would be unaware it even happened. And yet that was something very regressive that very much was jobs trumping environment. I think, I guess in terms of, let's come back to some of the points Alan was making earlier on. I mean, there's only, I mean, he's talked about in the past when we did the Keep It in the Ground campaign at The Guardian, he talked about, you know, journalism as being a rear view mirror and you report on things that have happened rather than the things that are going to come. And there's only, touches on what Stephen was saying, you know, there's only so many stories you can do on groups calling for, on think tanks and academics and others calling for a green stimulus, and nature groups calling on people to, you know, stop destroying the habitat of animals. Editors tend to prefer stories about concrete things that have happened, you know, or can be measured. So, you know, for example, we have done stories on the fact that carbon emissions did drop dramatically briefly, but there's only so many kind of stories you can pitch and successfully place on things that people want to happen, if you see what I mean. And I think that's just also touching on something Jess mentioned. I think it's interesting that we're talking about the environment here, but we're largely using it as a synonym for climate change, you know, even though biodiversity and wildlife loss are much more relevant in terms of the provenance of this pandemic. We, you know, largely during this thing, they've gone uncovered. All the focus has been largely on climate change. Just to give one example, you know, when the UN Biodiversity and Climate Summits were postponed a couple of months ago, people barely even covered the fact that biodiversity one was covered. You know, it was all about the climate one, COP26, being delayed. So yeah, I think, and I guess it's just interesting really that I guess for me, one of the really interesting is just that scientists are from all sort of areas of science are sort of suddenly bringing environment in. And, you know, I was talking to a guy about mental health, just this, you know, a guy at the University of Nottingham who deals with dementia patients and works on mental health. And he just, you know, apropos of nothing at the end, he just started going on a big rant about the environment and about, you know, what this pandemic needs to teach us. So whether this is sort of feeding through to reporting as a whole yet and changing the framing, I think it's a bit early to say.
Thanks very much, Adam. Everything's still in play. I just want to turn to Natalie Hart now, who is from The Guardian and the former editor, though I should also add, of Le Monde, and joining us and looking at the building in the background, I suspect from France. Natalie, just if you unmute yourself, I can see you're still muted. Just all the dilemmas we're talking about in terms of getting any kind of traction for a more progressive business agenda in the UK press. Is it the same on the continent, or do you think it's different?
Hi, thanks for having me, and it's great to hear all these really interesting remarks. I wanted to bring two thoughts to the conversation. The first one is, and speaking from a journalistic or former editor point of view, let's be very careful that we don't content ourselves with preaching to the converted. We have to make an extra special effort to break out of silos on this question of protecting the environment, preventing climate change, etc. And I'm thinking about that. Yes, I'm in France right now. I'm thinking about that because I have in mind what happened in 2018 in this country. Remember the yellow vests? It started with people protesting against fuel tax, which itself was part of a pro-environmental policy that the government was wanting to unfold. And we have to be careful in Europe, across our societies, also in Britain. I think Britain is part of Europe. That in this context where we have a massive recession, we are heading towards very stark social tensions, big unemployment, that people will, we who do want to act, for a healthy debate on all these issues about nature, that we make sure that we're listening to those who are going to be extremely worried about their livelihoods. And we have to make that special effort to reach out. And in terms of media coverage, that means that, unlike, I would say, in the period that the run up to the Brexit vote, and the run up to the Trump vote, the run up to the Gilets jaunes in France, and other phenomenons of, middle class, lower middle class disgruntlement that we've witnessed in recent years. The media, the legacy media or the quality media, the reliable media are going to have to make an extra effort to tell the stories of people who are suffering in these circumstances, to hear their voices. I think we did not do that enough in previous episodes, and this will be a very big test. The second thing I wanted to share with you is, let's connect a few dots. Protecting, I hope you can still hear me. Okay, I'll be very short. Let's connect a few dots. Protecting the environment is, in fact, I think, connected to protecting democracy and fighting for democracy and fundamental rights. Don't expect an authoritarian regime like China to be at the forefront of this battle for nature, when it crushes people within its realm, right? Remember Liu Xiaobo, the dissident, Nobel Peace Prize. He died as a result of his imprisonment and torture. He was connected to, and he referred to, people in the dissident movement in the former communist bloc who themselves, and I'll just name one, Václav Havel. I'm thinking about him because very early on, before probably most of us were interested in protecting nature, dissidents in authoritarian regimes were fighting for that very same thing, because they established a link between that, protecting the dignity of nature, let's say, protecting the well-being of nature, and they connected that with protecting the well-being of individual human beings, individual freedoms. I wanted to bring that in because we have to connect those dots. Let's not box our thinking into just the business versus nature, or nature versus business. There's a nature and democracy fight to be waged. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Natalie. Now, time's running very short. If people are up for it, we'll maybe stay just a few minutes longer, not many minutes, just so we can slip in one or two questions. But before we do that, I'm going to bring in Duncan Weldon, just because as the Economist's British economics correspondent, you actually speak to businesses perhaps more than many of us do. How interested do you think they are in actually doing something about some of this?
Thank you, Tom. Also, I really enjoyed your introduction when you said now we'll turn from the experts to the media pundits. So I'm feeling, I'm feeling very good. No, I do speak to a lot of businesses, and I think the fair answer would be interest levels vary considerably. If we look at the finance sector, which is where Britain probably has its largest potential global impact, there's obviously been a lot of interest in recent years in so-called ESG funds, environmental, social governance, funds which apparently take some sort of ethical stance. A cynic would say one reason that the asset management industry has been very interested in ESG products is because they see it as a way of selling products to younger people who have often not been interested in traditional finance products, but polling suggests they're more interested in this sort of thing. I think the problem with a lot of that push is a lack of disclosure. So whereas we have very good accounting standards, which are generally cases like Wirecard to one side, stuck to. We can see what a company's accounts look like, how it's accounting for its revenue, what its profits are, detailed remuneration reports on corporate pay. But there is very, very little in the way of disclosure of environmental impact, of carbon footprints from businesses, of their overall impact on nature. And I think if young people want to put their money to work in ESG funds, that is all well and good, but without better rules on how the sort of impact on nature of businesses is reported, you end up using this sort of tick box approach drawn up by consultants. You're often charging a fee for that, and it all becomes very, very opaque.
Thank you, Duncan. If Adrian Monk, do you have a quick word on anything? And then we're going to just try and bring in, let's say, 2 questions that Chris can pick out from us, or comments from the panel. Anything you wanted to add, Adrian?
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, something I would say, which is to pick up on a theme that's run through a lot of the contributions so far, and something Akansha mentioned when she's talking about the opportunities there are for business and for new jobs when it comes to taking advantage of the opportunities for a greener economy. And that's something that I think is overlooked almost all the time, which is nobody wants to be that opportunity. Nobody wants to lose their job. Nobody in Poland wants to be pushed out of the mining industry. No one in Britain wanted to leave those colliery towns. And, we've done a terrible job at managing transitions. So when we talk about the opportunities, as we do here at the World Economic Forum, we have to be absolutely 100% careful to realize that people don't want to be our opportunities. They don't want to leave existing jobs, however grave the situation is environmentally out there. They want security. And unless we're willing to do a better job of managing those transitions, and this isn't just a UK problem, this is a problem across global economies, on reskilling people, not giving up on people, not slamming people onto disability benefit or dumping them on the unemployment pile, then we're going to have to do a much, much better job of selling what these opportunities are. I think that's absolutely important. And that's something people like Caroline Lucas are really going to have to grapple with in a big way, because nobody wants to be the price, the human price. They don't want their stories told. That's not, I'm sorry to say that, Natalie, it's not a quid pro quo for people. They don't want sympathy from the mainstream media. They don't want to be in those stories. So I think unless we address that, we're really going to have a conversation that's about 30,000 feet above where most people are.
A very useful corrective. Thank you very much, Adrian. Now I'm going to bring in my colleague, Chris Tilbury, who will speak to us from behind the screen, like the Wizard of Oz or something. Chris, any questions or comments that have caught your eye? Shorter the better, given that we're already at time.
Yeah. Thanks, Tom. Yeah, somebody has, I guess this is a question for quite a few people on the panel. They've mentioned George Monbiot in his book, Feral. He suggests that significant zones of the sea as well as the land should be protected from every kind of human activity in order to preserve them and ensure that they're there for future generations. I guess, various people on the panel, do you agree that that is a good thing to be kind of pushing in line with what we've kind of already discussed?
Okay, so I mean, maybe that's most naturally one for Natalie Hart or Torsten Thiel with the oceans angle there. Either of you interested in picking up on that?
I'm going to let Torsten or Dan answer that one.
Yeah, I'm quite happy to say a few words on that. So there is an overwhelming body of evidence which looks to the fact we need to protect far more of the land and sea than we're protecting at the moment. The figure of at least 30% is actually an old figure because it takes so long for these figures to come through the political process. That was back in 2014 that was debated. And the figures now that scientists say are much higher than that. But there is a caution here. And the caution I have is that the way we get out of this is by taking a whole ocean approach. You can no longer just look at protecting isolated island. I describe it as creating islands of hope in a sea of despair. You actually have to look across the piece. And as I said earlier, when you look across the piece at what science and economists are saying, investing in protecting more of the ocean, you get a big return, 5 times return of what you invest. The same with a sustainable economy across the rest of it. So it is a very important piece of the equation. But as ever, our problems are moving on in terms of scale and the diversity of them. The science is moving on, and we need to find a way of catching up the actions with what the science is telling us. And the science is telling us that we have a massive, massive problem here that isn't just about the day-to-day impacts that we thought about, it's about the whole ocean now changing. That requires not just a biodiversity response, it requires a climate response, coupling it together and understanding that the ocean is the beating heart, if you like, of how we regulate this planet. And you can't do one without the other. We've actually got to scale up and do a lot across the whole board. And as has just been said, we're going to have to be really careful how we invest to make sure we manage transitions and help people through these processes. You can't just put something out there and expect it to happen.
Thank you very much. And given the time, there'll be people in the audience as well as people on the panel who need to be in something else, probably another Zoom, given the way the world has gone of late. But Chris, have you got one more, which I think should be the final one that you could pick out from the audience?
Yeah, this one might be more for the kind of journalists on the panel. What is the role of the media, and what role can the media play in helping us to navigate towards this desire of having a better settlement kind of post-COVID in terms of the kind of interaction between nature and business?
Okay, are you still there, Alan? Would you like to say a quick word on navigating a way through?
Well, I mean, as I think I implied earlier, the more I think about it, I think the main role for media in future is going to be around trustworthy facts, which are the things that is in most short supply at the moment. The role that the British media has adopted for itself of leading with opinion and telling people how they should be living, I think, is something that's going to seem rather old-fashioned, and people are going to question the right of the people who have ended up owning newspaper presses or broadcasting stations. But this need for agreed facts is without which society can't work, is going to be the thing that is needed. Now, whether there's a business model for that or not, I don't know, but society needs it. So that's why I refer to it as a public service, because there are all kinds of things that societies need, but which don't necessarily work in a business sense. So I think the news media have a huge role to play in all this, but there has to be a violent shake-up, which I think is coming anyway, in terms of journalists reflecting really fundamentally about what business they're in.
Thank you very much. I can see other journalists on the panel nodding, which I'm going to use as an excuse. I'm going to let Natalie and Ugo just have one last word, but we really are up against time now. Natalie, unmute yourself, please.
Sorry. I just wanted to add to that again, you know, just to insist on the role of the media in terms of listening beyond their bubble, beyond the bubble of our, you know, our elites, to use that word. I think it's very important. If you think that, you know, people who go attend the World Economic Forum are part of the same world, the same debates, the same, you know, even information space as the bulk of the population in most of our countries, then you're deluding yourself. So I think it's very important to actually you know, make that effort. It's not about just listening to their stories. It's about documenting how people are affected by problems, and thus, in that way, you know, bringing their voices and their concerns to the policy-making level. And that's how you bridge. That's how you build that bridge between the economic concerns and the ecological ones. So I think listening and reaching out across, beyond social borders, beyond all sorts of boundaries is essential. And I think the media, very busy organizing debates, binary debates and conflicts, as you said, Tom, earlier, you know, choreographing conflict rather than describing complexity. The media have a responsibility there.
Thank you very much. I'm going to say it's time now, because we are nearly 10 minutes over, and lots of extremely busy people have given up time to be on this panel and to listen in the audience as well. We will send you round the WEF report for anyone who wants it, and that will be tomorrow. There will be a recording of some of the discussion here, which, depending on how far we polish it or not, will go up either imminently or a few days down the line if we edit it a little bit. Obviously, it's a conversation that is only going to keep rolling through the COVID crisis and beyond. But thank you very much to Gulbenkian Foundation for getting behind Prospect so we could put this discussion on. Thanks to all of the panelists for making time to talk to us, and thanks to all of you for tuning in at home. Thank you.